They learn how to cope under authoritarianism. And sometimes the dam breaks and they need to do something about it. And that doing something about it may or may not be directed for regime change. In the West, we tend to think about the big picture kinds of things. There's nothing wrong with the big picture. It's just that it misses all kinds of interesting and important smaller pictures. The big picture is, when will people rise up and overthrow the dictator in, fill in the blank, right? Iran or in,
America is the question I'm asking myself. This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn, joined today by my co-host, Maria Repnikova. How are you doing, Maria?
Doing great. Just getting out of meetings on how to self-censor.
Meetings to teach you how to self-censor. Ah, yes. American academia in 2025.
Things are wonderful over here.
Okay. Well, today, joining us from Canada is our guest, Edward Schatz, author of the book Slow Anti-Americanism, Social Movements and Symbolic Politics in Central Asia. He's the author and editor of many other influential books and articles on political science, including a popular volume on political ethnography. He's a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and directs the Center for European and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School. Ed researches social movements, anti-Americanism, and authoritarianism with a focus on the former USSR, particularly Central Asia. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Ed.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeremy and Maria. It's really great to be here.
Welcome again, Ed. So let's start to dive right into some concepts that you're very well familiar with, such as the fuzzy concept of authoritarianism. You have spent extensive time doing political ethnography in Central Asia, which boasts a variety of authoritarian regimes. In one of your pieces on this topic, you critique the one-fits-all understanding of authoritarianism and talk about its distinct pillars in different authoritarian countries. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I really think that one size does not fit all. That probably goes for most categories that we use in the social sciences. But in this particular case, authoritarianism as a term is overused. It's fuzzy. All you have to do is go online for a few minutes, as you know, and see people throwing the term authoritarianism or authoritarian around like an epithet. So, much depends on the definitions, but there's no question that if we look at Central Asia, there's great variety. They're all ruled by authoritarian regimes. It's just that there's a variety of what that means. And the variety is not just on one dimension. So you could take the classic dimension that most people think about when they think about authoritarianism, and that is repression. And you could array the states of Central Asia from the most repressive to the least repressive. In this case, it would be Turkmenistan on one end, the most repressive, to the least repressive might be Kyrgyzstan or potentially Kazakhstan, depending on how you measure these things. And that dimension, of course, captures something very important. There's no way to think about authoritarianism without thinking about repression. But it's not the only thing. You could array the states on dimension on the resource endowments, which is enormously consequential for how these different states operate and how the state interacts with society, which is something that is of interest.
When you say resource endowments, are you talking about oil and fossil fuels primarily?
Yeah, oil and fossil fuels. But if you just look at essentially the pillars of their economy, the ability of an elite to control resources versus being reliant, for example, on taxation. This sets each of the different types of, yes, authoritarian rules, but on different kinds of authoritarian paths, whether they need to rely to some degree on taxing the population. Then at some point, there's a degree of dependence that goes in the other direction. And that's essentially the story we tell ourselves of democratization in political science. And you can array these regimes on a whole variety of other dimensions, the degree to which they're engaged in exclusionary nationalism versus inclusionary versions, slightly more civic versions of nationalism, how they approach civil society groups, as enemies a priori, or do they approach them as potential allies in shoring up some kind of authoritarian order? So, there are a lot of different dimensions. I mean, we can dive into any one of them, further, but that's plain as soon as you spend any kind of time in Central Asia. And yet they all come kind of from the cloth of the former Soviet Union. So they started in one place that was kind of similar. They kind of were endowed with the same institutions from the Soviet collapse, and yet they end up in significantly enough different places to call them different flavors of authoritarianism, for sure.
When you say they inherited the same types of institutions from the Soviet Union, Do you think that enabled an easier sort of rollout of authoritarianism by the new post-Soviet leaders? Did they already have the political structures and social structures in place that made it very easy for them not to fulfill the promise of democracy, but rather to go down an authoritarian road?
I think so, but I think we forgot that in the 1990s because we all had incredibly high hopes. This is when I was becoming a political scientist and learning about this part of the world at the beginning of my career. I think we all had hope for political liberalization in these spaces. And sometimes we mistook what was really a sort of what my colleague here at the University of Toronto calls liberalism by default or democracy by default. In other words, what you have is weak states. They're unconsolidated, where the institutions have been shaken by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And because they've been shaken, the regime is not in any position to try to rein in civil society. If there was the whiff of freedom, it was really more the whiff of a weak state. The regime, actually, in particular, couldn't really do anything in the 1990s. But I think you're right. Many of the institutions that, are Soviet in origin, whether it's the secret services and its role in society, whether it's the role of, Maria studies the media, where it's, the role that the media normatively plays in society, propaganda, all these kinds of things, or even the way economic interactions are structured by the center and the state is understood to have a huge role in that, if not an all-determining role. Those were the inheritances of the Soviet state. But it's different in different parts of former Soviet Union. Those that are closer to Europe had all kinds of connections with Europe and maybe incentives to try to develop new institutions. Those in Central Asia were more or less forgotten, at least by the West, and pretty clearly eventually fell back into Russia's broad orbit.
If we think about Belarus, it seems to be kind of a bizarre example of a country that's in Europe, but still very authoritarian, kind of echoing similar institutions and leadership styles.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. To go back to the variation of authoritarian systems in Central Asia, since you studied this in detail and explained to us how there are various forms of repression, legitimation strategies, extractive mechanisms, and maybe ways of protests against these systems as well. Is this term authoritarianism even useful to us when we think about the broader shift we're experiencing in the world today? And it's often being thrown around to talk about the US and many other contexts. What do you think about just the usage of this term in today's popular discourse, media, etc.?
I mean, it's a great question. It's the right question. It's also a hard question because I do think that scholars and other analysts are able to use it with enough precision that we can have a discussion about whether something qualifies as authoritarianism or whether it needs a few modifiers and adjectives in order to put some nuance on it. I do think that in popular discourse, it ends up being, like I've said, thrown around like an epithet. And so I think it's a way to discredit your opponent or some kind of behavior or practice that you disagree with. So I think that there's a difference between how it's used in practice and maybe how it's used in analyses. But even within the sort of analytic space, which is where I spend most of my time, I follow Wittgenstein, who talks about family resemblances. And when he talks about, he says concepts we should think about as family resemblances, just like in any given family, you're going to have certain members sharing certain kinds of physical or psycho-emotional traits or tendencies. But not everybody in the family is going to, let's say, have freckles. You might have 3 people with freckles and others without, 3 people with, certain kind of hair and others without. So there's variety within a family, and yet there's nothing to prevent us from saying that that's still family. There's still a family resemblance, that on the whole, there is something that they might have. There's a cluster of traits that they might have generally in common. So I do think authoritarianism is a useful term. I do think that if we simply gloss everything as authoritarian, we miss a lot of the nuance about what we mean. It's a perfectly fine place to start a conversation. And it's really when we identify spaces that lack democratic accountability and where it's about rule through coercion and potentially through patronage as well. So the mechanisms of rule or of exercising power are simply not democratic. But beyond that very abstract consideration, like it can go in any number of directions. And I remember this, just to turn a little bit to Central Asia, if you'll forgive me. I remember these endless debates in the 1990s, Maria, you may remember them as well, about whether Kyrgyzstan is an island of democracy in the region. And there was a terrific book with it that hedged a little bit by putting a question mark at the end, island of democracy, question mark. And the discussions tended to miss a key point. I alluded to it a little bit earlier, which is that whatever regime type we want to slot 1990s, 2000s Kyrgyzstan into, it was an unconsolidated political order with critically weak institutions. Is it democratic? Is it authoritarian? Is it some kind of hybrid? really the most important factor at play in that context was the weakness of the state apparatus that was hugely consequential for enabling pretty modest or moderate-sized street mobilization to topple a series of incumbent leaders. You wouldn't see that if institutions had been consolidated, whether they're democratic or authoritarian. Really, the main question was state weakness in that context.
And it's interesting, the Kyrgyzstan island of democracy question mark makes me recall, I don't know if you're familiar with Betteridge's law of headlines. It's a journalist concept, which is if the headline has a question mark in it, the answer is no. But anyway, to stay in Central Asia, one of your books, Modern Clan Politics, The Power of Blood in Kazakhstan and Beyond, with blood in quotation marks, is about broadly the persistence and transformation of clan politics in that Central Asian country. How big of a role do clan politics play in the way Kazakhstan and other Central Asian authoritarian governments work?
Yeah. So that book was the product of my doctoral dissertation, and it was published in 2004. So it's now 20 years old. So it's great always to, look back at something that you worked on for a long time and see the extent to which it sort of withstands the test of time. I would say, well, a couple of things. First of all, the way that I understand the term clan might be a little bit different than what you might get in sort of ordinary discussions of the term. Sometimes we use in the just ordinary discourse the word clan to mean some kind of tight-knit group, usually bound by some kind of ulterior motive for self-aggrandizement or protection of their own interests. Sort of an exclusive kind of group where others need not apply. And of course, originally the term comes from anthropological literature and it implies connections based on kinship. But the metaphorical use doesn't really necessarily have that kind of kinship connection. The three of us are connected as a clan if we share common interests and demonstrate loyalty to each other. That's how it's used metaphorically. I'm trying to stick to the more anthropological use of the term where I'm talking about actual kin connections. So what you see in Central Asia is a whole lot of those metaphorical metaphorical clans rather, but then also the use of actual kinship networks. The metaphorical stuff is financial, industrial groups, oligarchs, and their networks. It cuts in a variety of different ways, depending on the particular context. But what I'm looking at is the way in which kinship networks are used as a resource by different actors across, particularly Kazakhstan, but that book contains some comparisons with some of the other cases of the region. The way in which ordinary people and also policymakers use their kinship connections to try to build trust, to try to engage in collective action, to try to gain access to goods that are in scarce supply. So it's a sort of a resource for people across the board. And to that extent, the analysis, I think, withstands the test of time. It's not like everybody everywhere is always using their kinship connections, but people do tend to have quite extensive networks of kin. Some of it's fictive kin and this sort of thing. It's a bit hard to establish, but the norm at least among Kazakhs in Central Asia, is to know 7 generations of your kin connections, which, in the West seems like a long way to go. Like most of us need some kind of an online genealogical service in order to keep track of all this. But the norm is to have this in your head. And then you've got a map that allows you, in the context of limited access to scarce goods, to avail yourself of this to try to get stuff that you need or that you want, or climb your way to power or what have you. So a long way of saying it was a simple question. And sorry, I'm trying to summarize a book. It was written a lot. But a long way of saying that this is an important dimension, though I wouldn't say it's the only thing when we think about Kazakhstan today. It's one of the factors that one should not ignore at key moments when there's a succession, when there's a question of, who comes next in the presidency, when it's a question of whom the president appoints to be the regional leaders of the different provinces, the oblasts in Central Asia, and all these kinds of questions come up at politically sensitive moments.
Thank you for this. Despite the state repression of dissent, there have been a few outbreaks of popular protests in Central Asia, perhaps most notably the January 2022 Kazakhstan protests. Can you talk about these protests and how protests generally play out in Central Asia over the past decade?
Yeah. So protest is a really interesting thing. I mean, it kind of gets back to something I said a little bit ago. The way I think about authoritarianism is let me expand on a thought. Authoritarian regimes vary a lot. I've already sort of suggested that. One of the ways in which they vary is their relationship to society. I think we tend to, because many of us are political scientists, but even in a non-specialist way of thinking about the question, you go, oh, it's an authoritarian regime. This is top-down exercise of power. And then we tend to think of the people on the receiving end of that power as victims. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, people arguably living in authoritarian regimes are to some extent victims. But if you end the analysis there and just sort of say victim full stop, then you miss all kinds of social ferment, all kinds of protests, all kinds of ways in which people are courageous or creative. They learn how to cope under authoritarianism. And sometimes the dam breaks and they need to do something about it. And that doing something about it may or may not be directed for regime change. In the West, we tend to think about the big picture kinds of things. There's nothing wrong with the big picture. It's just that it misses all kinds of interesting and important smaller pictures. The big picture is, when will people rise up and overthrow the dictator in, fill in the blank, right? Iran or in,
America is the question I'm asking myself currently right now.
Doesn't look like it's happening, does it?
Well, exactly. This is a question we should definitely be asking. No, America is actually an interesting example here of what I'm trying to say. That is the big question, but then there are all kinds of smaller questions. How do people interact with the regime such that they might drag their feet when they're asked to carry out some kind of a directive that they consider to be unjust or authoritarian? How do they engage in small acts of resistance that might, look, in the global scheme of things, amount to nothing by itself? But again, courage is contagious. Like, it potentially can inspire people who are in a similar position to do whatever they can to try to, again, maybe not overthrow the regime, because we shouldn't assume that everyone is sitting there waiting for that moment when they can finally have that just order that they all dream of. That leads us to all kinds of problems, because I think most people, most of the time, are just trying to get along. And maybe we in general, but certainly we political scientists tend to ignore that very important point. But there are a lot of things that people want to do to make the order that they live in better. Maybe not necessarily different, but better. You may find that in general, the existing political order is legitimate, or at least you're willing to accept it, but your local stream needs cleaning up and the regime is not doing anything. There may be an opportunity to approach local authorities and demand that something be done. And we shouldn't assume that authoritarian regimes, just by their very nature, are deaf to these kinds of calls. They're not as good as democracies on average tend to be, but there's a lot of social ferment and so on. Okay, that's a long prelude way of saying there's a lot going on in authoritarianism. And so there are protest movements, or there's social mobilization of various sorts. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes people are sort of biding their time. Right now, the pro-democracy folks, the European-style liberals, people who care about rights and rule of law and so on, they're lying low.
Kazakhstan.
Yeah, Kazakhstan, across Central Asia. This is not the time to be beating the drum, because you're not going to achieve the kind of social resonance. You're not going to have allies, particularly in the regime, or if you do, there are not going to be enough of them. This is just not the moment. But that doesn't mean that there's no democracy movement. LGBTQ rights, like, that's, again, off the table as a matter of sort of public protests. But are there quietly any number of things happening? Absolutely, across the region.
Ed, could we go back a step? Because we sort of missed the picture of where Kazakhstan is right now. Like, how would you characterize the current government?
Okay, simple picture. It's an authoritarian government that likes to think of itself as a benign authoritarianism, as a responsive government that engages in global best practices on, you name it, whether it's e-government or whether it's consultation with the broad public. But a lot of these are facade institutions. Most of what it's doing is not democratic, but it presents itself as democratic. It's an authoritarian regime that may be slightly softer regime than its predecessor, basically up to 2019, but it still would be squarely in that category of authoritarian.
So just to kind of go back to protests for a moment, when you were describing these quiet movements and also critiquing this idea that we're expecting, or sometimes I think scholars and maybe less of scholars, but what journalists are expecting something very dramatic to happen in some of these systems, it reminded me a lot of China, where both Jeremy and I have lived, though Jeremy spent much longer time there, but there were so many protest movements taking place routinely that are against very specific policies, like certain polluting factories were being protested against and particular corrupt policies of the local government. And oftentimes the central government would kind of address them and mitigate this tension. And sometimes it led to satisfying results for the public, sometimes it didn't, but there's often this kind of local central dynamic and people can vent and come out when it comes to very specific issues at a specific scale. So I was wondering if there's something similar you've observed in Kazakhstan, or is it something that's distinct because Chinese description is unique, or you think that's kind of something you observed as well in other places?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds familiar. It certainly, it rhymes with China, at least what happens in Kazakhstan from that description. I mean, I do think that there's a couple of things. I mean, we shouldn't assume, and you're clearly not assuming, we shouldn't assume that the regime is against any and all form of protest. Two things here. One, protest actually, as long as it's contained, because no regime that's authoritarian wants to see protest get, quote unquote, out of control. So as long as it's on a containable scale, I think these regimes are happy to receive information that protests supply. I mean, remember, in the absence of democratic accountability, in the absence of meaningful public opinion polling, other mechanisms for knowing what the general public thinks, but the regime is interested in knowing what the general public thinks, to provide enough public goods so that there's no, let's say, social revolution. I mean, that's the basic bargain, is that we'll provide you with some kind of material plenty enough for security, but we need to know how to do that. And so if they don't know that the local stream is dirty, they may be grateful that you've drawn their attention to it, potentially, because then they can address a sort of a social problem before it becomes too big. But the second thing is, and I think this is probably the case in China, but that's your area of expertise, both of you, is that there can be a sort of center regional dynamic to this as well. Sometimes, you might let an anti-corruption protest go if you want to take the local, like if you're the central government, you sort of say, okay, they're protesting about local corruption, or the journalists are starting to uncover some kind of corrupt scheme and it implicates local authorities. Let that go, let it run its course. And that way you can discredit and eventually come down on the side of anti-corruption. And then you can get rid of somebody who's maybe, been a thorn in your side.
Have you seen that happen in Kazakhstan, Ed?
Oh, all the time. All the time.
And what were some specific issues that people were protesting?
Well, so protests these days is as much online as it is in the streets. So at least all kinds of conceptual questions about when it's protest, when it's just sort of awareness raising and things like that. But the coverage and the attention paid to, for example, this question of corruption is very, very clear. So just one example is the light rail system in Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, which was built at tremendous cost. Actually, initially it wasn't built. It stalled because so much of the money seemed to have vanished into thin air. Cost overruns, inflated contracts. I mean, all the kind of standard aspects of corruption given large-scale infrastructure projects. And people got very frustrated. Like, people can tolerate corruption in Central Asia. I'm making a big generalization here, but I would say on average, people tolerate a lot as long as stuff gets done. If the rail gets built or the road gets constructed or the port gets constructed eventually, but it costs extra money, then, that maybe that's just the cost of doing business. But at least we can use the port, or that we can use the roads, or we can use the rail system. But when something doesn't get built, so the light rail system in Astana was stalled for at least a couple of years, and it locally came to be known as the monument to corruption. And it's really like just giant, what do you call those things? The sort of pillars. The rail is an elevated rail thing, and all they built were the pillars, and there's nothing going across. And so it really reads codes in society as a monument to corruption. And that's a visible problem. And the regime didn't know what to do, because a lot of this money was financed by the Chinese BRI project, the Belt and Road project, Belt and Road Initiative. And Kazakhstan didn't want to embarrass China or admit that the money had gone elsewhere. But eventually they ended up cracking down on local authorities in Astana. Whether they were actually the ones responsible or not is really hard to know, but that's the political game.
And is the project complete now, or is it still just those pillars?
This is now October the 3rd. The last I checked, they were on the verge of opening the system. So I think it was becoming an embarrassment, not to mention a political liability for the local regime.
So it never actually worked. It never had that functionality.
It is now about to open its doors.
Yeah, but for now, it hasn't had it.
No, yeah. So there was a delay of about 2 years, and then they, at a tremendous extra cost, decided to finish it, and they sent in only Chinese laborers to, as far as I can tell, to finish the job, get it done properly so that you've got this public good. And, how good it's going to be, how available to the public it's going to be, we'll find out as the years roll on. How long it'll last, that's the other question.
It's really interesting because it made me think of Ethiopia, where I've been doing research for my new book, and that they also had this light rail system and it did function. But after just a couple of years, almost half the trains broke down. So basically it's like half capacity, even 30% capacity. So the trains just don't come very often. So you see the pillars, but there are few trains, and the ones that come are overcrowded. So in many minds of Ethiopians, it also stands as kind of a monument of corruption. Although I don't know about Kazakhstan, but it's oftentimes the blame is diffused across China versus local governments, national governments. It's unclear who's responsible, but it definitely is a striking sign of something going wrong.
You can see the malfeasance of whatever it is. Something has gone wrong.
It's very visible.
Right. Yeah.
Either there's no train, or there are very few trains. It's clear that something isn't what it was supposed to be. The function isn't there.
Right. And then somebody glides past you in like a brand new, Rolls Royce, and it kind of pisses you off. It's not just governments of Kazakhstan or Ethiopia or China that there are popular movements protesting against. And in fact, Ed, you've researched anti-Americanism in Central Asia, and your book, Slow Anti-Americanism, Social Movements and Symbolic Politics in Central Asia, you look at the United States as a symbol that is used for various political purposes. And you point out it's a particularly powerful and malleable symbol, partly because the US has not actually ever been much of a real presence in Central Asia. Can you talk a bit about what political purposes people in Central Asia use America as a symbol for?
Yeah, absolutely. It feels almost weird to be talking about it at this moment, but once upon a time.
Yeah. In the before times.
My God.
Before times. Look, I think most of us would recognize it, and maybe this hasn't disappeared entirely, but, the United States is globally resonant on a symbolic plane, and setting aside what it actually does, its actual policies. This is why Central Asia is particularly interesting, because its material footprint in the region is quite limited, but in sort of the way it's imagined, America has loomed quite large. And this is, in a way, the story of the end of the Cold War, where, broadly speaking, these societies were, at least in the early 90s and through the mid 90s, pretty enamored of everything the United States seemed to represent, whether it was freedom or prosperity. And those two were sort of understood to be fused, part of the problem, but nonetheless, that's how it sort of came down. And the U.S. did nothing, of course, in the afterglow of the Soviet collapse to disabuse anybody of the notion that the United States was truly the model market economy, political order. But of course, there were always others who viewed the United States as a symbol of something quite different, as a symbol of material excess, as a symbol of abuse of power, of hypocrisy, especially if you think about claims that the U.S. makes in terms of its global role and then its actual actions. And I'm not taking a side on any particular kind of thing, but just you can recognize both of these narratives as pretty powerful. And I think they have echoes, across North America as well. But in Central Asia, mostly it was the first narrative. The United States can do no wrong. It's a model, and so on and so forth. But by the end of the 1990s, things are starting to shift. And it happens in slow ways. And that's why I gave the book the title Slow Anti-Americanism, because the shift, we normally think that the US does something wrong. Everyone goes, you did something wrong or something immoral or something hypocritical, and therefore we're going to call you out on it, and we no longer like the United States. So that there's something that happens, especially in foreign policy, that generates a backlash. That's a perfectly plausible story. There are moments in American foreign policy that I'm sure many of us would like to rerun. The invasion of Iraq comes to mind as a pretty watershed moment for changing sort of global attitudes about the United States. There are others as well. But the story I tell in the Central Asian context is a much more gradual one, because again, the U.S. is not terribly present in a material sense, but it's people come to realize that the promises that have been made about how they might gradually become more and more like the United States. Sometimes the language was become a normal country. Maria might recognize that. We're going to become a normal country. It means, prosperous and free. Okay. But those promises, that failed to materialize. So then who do you blame? Well, it's always complicated. It's a combination of blaming the local regime and the choices that they've made. But there's also a sense that maybe the model that was dangled before us was never what it seemed to be. Maybe the United States had interests other than seeing us prosper and become free. I'm not trying to gin up some kind of conspiracy thinking, though you can see how some people might. But people just basically are disappointed after expectations have been set, what I would suggest to be too high. And so that's what the book tries to do, is document the sort of, in a way, how the shine comes off the American model, and then the impact that has on social movements. And just really briefly, the story there that I try to tell in the book is how groups or movements that had attached themselves to a positive view of the United States, mostly rights groups, but the occasional Islamist group, and this may sound paradoxical, but there was the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan, was a big fan of American secularism, right? The model of secularism, maybe not how it's actually plays out in real life in the United States, but the idea that of a separation of religion and state, they thought was the only way to protect themselves and their community of the faithful from the depredations of the authoritarian ruler. And so they were big fans of the United States and what they took it to represent. Both of those groups, once the shine comes off the US model, they now are saddled with a real problem. They've hitched their wagon, or what's the expression? They've hitched their horse to the wrong wagon, maybe something like that. It becomes a liability for them, and their movements lose resonance very quickly. And on the other side, those who've been quietly mounting critiques of the United States, especially on moral grounds, right? So a lot of these would be Islamists, but also labor activists offering a critique of the United States. They find themselves in a position to benefit as the sort of shine comes off the US model. So it's in a way a complex story, but basically what it comes down to is the impact of the United States is not just what it does, but it's how what it symbolizes is filtered through sort of local societies and states, and that can become enormously consequential on the ground.
So since in the book you argue that the decline of the image of the US in Central Asia has been very gradual and almost invisible to outsiders, how did you realize yourself that it was happening? Did you spot particular signs that were indicative of that, something that maybe others could apply in other contexts as well?
So yeah, I did the boring work to get there. Basically creating databases of newsworthy events that happen across the region on a day-by-day basis, and looking at how different actors, whenever they invoke the United States, sort of how they do it. Do they do it with a positive valence, a negative valence, a neutral valence, and so on? And if you chart that, daily, and over time, you can begin to see very clearly the decline. It's not as if everyone suddenly, becomes so disenchanted with the United States that they all just want to go out and burn flags. Like, that's not the story. It's a story of, being incredibly positive about the United States to being kind of ambivalent, and some people being quite negative. But the overall story is there's societies that, have mixed emotions.
And how much do you think it has to do with government messaging versus kind of organic bottom-up sentiments? Like, how much is it shaped by propaganda and media narratives that are directed by the government against the US?
The local governments or the American?
I guess both local and national, just thinking about anti-Americanism, let's say in Chinese media, it's really hard to distinguish between what Chinese state media is saying as part of like directives of the propaganda department, which is often recently in the past couple of years is very anti-American, versus people's perspectives. Like, people also on social media express a lot more anti-American perspectives and views. So sometimes it's very hard to tell, like, is it their own views? Like, do they really believe this? Or is it because it's shaped by official media that are in turn directed by the government?
So most of the turn that we see, most of the change and the decline in the image of the United States happens, it's visible by the early 2000s, before 9/11 and before the invasion of Iraq. So, and this is clearly the pre-social media era. So what we're looking at is, it's not particularly ordinary people. We don't have a couple of exceptions. Mostly we have spotty public opinion polls of any kind of quality. So I would say that for the most part, it's more organic. It's not driven by the media. Now, it may be different now. I'm going to give one little nuance to that claim. So it's mostly driven by the way that people's lives are not necessarily improving. We thought that if we started smoking Marlboro cigarettes and wore jeans, that everything would be great. I'm trivializing it, obviously. And that hasn't materialized. So our lives are, Now I'm wearing jeans and poor. Like, it's not.
So it's kind of about like the American model, its ideals and whatever is imagined to be, it's imagined to be and not working basically. So it's
not working.
It's not working. So as a result, America itself becomes less popular.
If it's working so slowly that ordinary people
they're not feeling it. Yeah.
They're not feeling it. And they don't feel that their governments, which in their mind have heeded American advice, asterisk, not true, but doesn't matter. This is the perception that their governments are complicit in this. But there's one nuance to this discussion, and that is Russian media. Because Russian media penetration, I mean, we like to talk about how important it has become, how aggressive it has become, and all that's true. But it never really disappeared from Central Asia, especially Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, to a lesser extent, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. But it never entirely exited. And that matters because the Russian media really sours on the United States in about 1998 and 1999. You get a financial crisis, you get NATO attacking Serb positions in Kosovo. And so the attitude in the Russian establishment, and I think it's shared broadly by the Russian public, why it becomes so resonant, is that the West really didn't want our prosperity and our freedom in the first place, that actually this is all just some kind of a plot. It leans into conspiratorial thinking. But all of that filters into broadcasts that end up in Central Asia. There is independent broadcasting in Central Asia. It's not simply captured by the Russian media and so on and so forth. But those discourses naturally filter into the space because many people in the region still look, even to this day, even in the context of the war, still look to Russian broadcasting as higher quality broadcasting that they can understand. It's in one of their languages, at least, which is, for many people, still Russian.
Yes, it's very interesting because in the context of repression, Russia has also been assisting the authoritarian governments, at least some of them in the case of Kazakhstan, with military technologies and actual armed forces to squash dissent. Is that something that you see as continuing? This was 2022, that Russia is actively participating in this repressive assistance, support for anti-democratic or squashing democratic movements, essentially, in Central Asia? Or has that kind of stalled since there's less of that kind of movement anyway?
Yeah. I mean, there's no question that there are deep interconnections between security services on, the Russian side and the Central Asian side. There's a lot of intelligence sharing. There's a lot of coordination. There's a lot of military to military assistance. And the basic understanding is that we're shoring up each other's incumbencies. They don't describe, so it's an authoritarian club. It's a self-help club and help each other out. So that's the basic spirit of things. But I wouldn't exaggerate that either. Like, I think that, for example, that in 2022, there were these, let me just back up a sec, because I'm not sure that folks, would necessarily know about this. So there were a series of events that lasted a week, 2 weeks, depending on how you count it, widespread nationwide protests in Kazakhstan across major cities that started off peaceful, eventually ended up with some seizures of local government buildings, and they're trying to call into question the legitimacy of the regime. And it came from a variety, all kinds of walks of life. One could talk about the coalition that really represented, but they shared this anti-Tokayev, the current president, sort of sentiment, frustration with his rule. And things got a little bit out of hand. Now, the reason why things got out of hand is complex. There are all kinds of suggestions that the regime sent out, or maybe people associated with the previous regime sent out all kinds of provocateurs to basically stir up trouble and create a pretext for the regime to really, really physically crack down. But in this context, where the regime was finding things getting out of its control, it appealed to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a Russia-led security organization, which is a little different from appealing to Russia itself, but only a little bit different. So formally what happened is Kazakhstan requested assistance on the security dimension because they had domestic unrest. And formally, the CSTO said, considered the request, and then eventually sent Russian troops to guard important objects around the city, not to actually fire on protesters or to keep order of people, but electrical stations or these kinds of things. And then they left after like 2 weeks. Don't quote me on the exact number, but it was a matter of weeks before, and the Russian troops were gone. I think that's probably not best understood as, Russia imposing its will. That's probably best understood as Tokayev, the incumbent president of Kazakhstan, saying, I need help here. I'm going to run to my authoritarian and well-equipped authoritarian, call him bigger brother. But I know there's a liability there as well. I don't want these Russian troops, to fire on protesters, because that could be really, really ugly. I don't want to be associated with a violation of our own national sovereignty by inviting troops from the former colonial power. So I want to make it very formal, very legible, bring in the troops, reestablish order, and then get the heck out. Get out as quickly as possible. And, there were all kinds of calls about how Tokayev has, sold out Kazakhstani sovereignty. But just as they were starting to get a little bit of momentum, the troops left. And they did leave. Now, the thing is, and this is to your original point, like the specter of Russia hangs over this all the time. And so by having invited these troops in once, it reminds people that they can be invited in again at any moment. So whatever the regime lacks in its own sort of domestic, military, or order-creating security capacity, it can, enhance it by calling in Russia. And as long as Russia's willing and able, it's unclear whether Russia would be able to help right now, given that it's otherwise occupied. But as long as it's able, of course, Russia will be happy to do so.
And it's up to the would-be protester to make that kind of risk calculation, which would put a lot of people off. How much worse has the United States' image got in the last 8 months in Central Asia? Or better, maybe?
I think in general, the image has gotten worse. I'm not on the ground right now. I'm not doing the systematic data collection that I did for the book. So I can't say for sure, but impressionistically, I would say that people have given up on the United States as a reliable partner. If you're looking for a reliable partner, it's not Russia either. Probably never was. Russia was at best the devil and that you sometimes have to rely on, and is willing to participate. China, who wins the Russia-Ukraine war? Who wins the Trump presidency? Is China, right? China, at least in the Central Asian context, China comes to be seen as a much more reliable partner in for the longer term, whose interests are clearly being pursued by Beijing itself, but that are not entirely different from the interests of Central Asian states and societies. So China, in a relative sense, comes to be seen as a more reliable kind of thing. Now, having said all of that, so you can end the story there. But one of the sort of stuff's complex. So you talk to people on the ground, and Trump is interesting because the way he operates, it is so alien to many of us in the West. That's part of what's surprising, and I'll speak for myself, disgusting and frustrating and scary about him is the way he operates. But it's very, very legible to folks on the ground in Central Asia. It's like, well, that's what world leaders do. They operate in obvious pursuit of their own self-interest. They're incredibly transactional. They're super unreliable, but sometimes they make you a deal that you can't refuse. What's strange here? So it's almost as if the Trump way of doing business is like, oh, yeah, we can work with him because we know exactly how to do it. You stroke his ego. You maybe settle for some kind of a short-term gain that you can extract from that relationship. And, maybe that's a little more common in the region than something rules-based or based on contracts or based on long-term alliances and reliable partnerships.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a fellow from Uzbekistan here last year, and he said very similar things that, we're just trying to grapple with the return of Trump. And I think he was here right at the election. Actually, yeah, he was with this election. And I came into the office very gloomy and, just feeling all the feelings. And he had no understanding of why. He's like, well, he understood a little bit, but he said, well, Central Asia and Uzbekistan, we don't really see it that way. And he's somebody we can easily do business with. Yeah, everything you said, reliability in some form, just kind of knowing how to interact with him, knowing how to kind of cater to him, knowing what to expect, and then not having this intrusive democratic promotion. Goes back to the image of the U.S. as democracy. It's like not having those intrusive policies dictating the relationship of the U.S. with Uzbekistan or other Central Asian countries. Like it's just business. And that's something that those governments are very used to. So that was, very much related or complementing what you were saying just now.
And I suppose many Central Asian officials know a gold shop to get a suitable objet d'art for display in the Oval Office.
Absolutely. And if they don't know themselves, they know a guy who knows a guy.
Someone in the clan.
Get the biggest golden ring.
And be willing to kiss it. That's the other thing. This performance of loyalty is something that's very familiar to Central Asians. It really grates, I think, your average North American to see people grovel before the feet of Donald Trump. But for many in Central Asia, this would be something that, okay, not everybody, obviously, but many people are willing to accept as, I guess, the price of doing business.
That's politics. Yeah.
So as we're talking about Central Asia and potential embrace of Trump, it makes me think about just the spread of autocracy everywhere. What are the selling points for defending democracy in this current moment? In one of your writings, you talk about democratic institutions as being more humane and more fair. Do you still think so?
I do. I mean, obviously, you have to talk about specific democracies and under specific circumstances. One of the things that before Trump 2.0, maybe even before Trump 1.0, whether it's criminal justice or whether it's economic chances in the United States, democracy was under strain because of things external to the democratic process itself. Rising social inequality, economic inequality puts all kinds of strains on the ability of democratic institutions to deliver justice. This is all pre-Trump. And we know it's been going on for a long time. You don't have to look very far. So the devil's always in the details. It depends on the democratic institutions. By themselves, democratic institutions, given the right circumstances, I do think are in the best position to deliver justice and some kind, humane outcomes. I am a fan. I remain a fan. Call me old-fashioned. In the year of 2025, I do think the democratic accountability is incredibly important. But I think that one of the problems, and I kind of briefly alluded to it earlier in our conversation, one of the problems both analysts and I think people in, call it the real world made in the 1990s, it was that we conflated prosperity or economic freedom with political freedom. And we made some kind of claim that the two necessarily went together, that the best way to enjoy economic prosperity was with democracy. And in a way, we overclaimed. And we all goofed. I goofed too. I mean, I fell for this in the 1990s. I mean, slightly in my defense, I was young and just beginning to study these kinds of things. But I bought that basic story for sure.
And the 90s was a hell of a drug.
Thank you. I'm off it now.
Me too.
Turns out that was the anomaly. It was not the end of history.
Yeah.
But yeah, so here we are. And I think that if we can maintain a proper separation of two questions that we've conflated in the past, how do we achieve economic prosperity and economic justice? Because I think those two things need to go together in the same conversation. And also, how do we achieve political freedom? Keep those things separate, the political side and the economic side. I think we serve ourselves much better because I think the jury's out as to which kind of political order is best positioned to generate material prosperity. It turns out you can generate material prosperity in any number of ways. I don't have to tell, China specialists about that. There's so many routes to material prosperity. But if we think, and I do, and I think most people around the globe do, that, our lives are not simply, they start off being about material prosperity or material sufficiency at least, but that's not the only thing that makes human life full. And I think there's always going to be a demand for the political side of the equation. And I think that we need to evaluate democracy on its own terms, on its ability to deliver justice, to deliver voice, to deliver participation. These are goods in and of themselves, whether or not they generate an economic boom or not. It's an entirely separate question. I would defend democracy on that dimension. Final thing I'll say on this is I don't want to be naive about this, but I do think that there's a potential to recalibrate what we mean by democracy promotion. I mean, democracy for export didn't work. It didn't work, and it, in fact, seemed to generate a bit of a backlash or a significant backlash, depending on how you look at it. But if we can keep these two things separate and say democracy actually speaks for itself, I really do think it does. I do think that there is a degree to which Americans look to Canada, and at least until recently, Canadians looked to the United States and said, kind of like that. I like what they've got. In some ways, Canada was more democratic. In some ways, the United States was more democratic. There is this attraction. I think that that's there organically. I don't think you need to sell democracy. I don't think you need to promote democracy in any active sense. I think you just simply need to be democratic. And this is where, so much depends upon the willingness of ordinary Americans and Americans in positions of power to fight in whatever way they see possible and whatever way they're able to do to fight the tendencies towards authoritarianism.
What is your outlook on that?
Let me say the hopeful part, and then I'll answer you. The hopeful part is that Americans actually pick up this mantle and do something about it because that re-inspires others around the globe. It really does. I mean, American protest movements, whatever period in historical time, have inspired people around the globe. whether it's suffrage movements or civil rights movements or Me Too or Black Lives Matter, it can be inspirational, and it can have a huge effect. And if Americans, fend off these authoritarian incursions properly, then I think that bodes pretty well for the pendulum swinging somewhat back in the direction of, democracy being attractive globally. Okay, will it happen? Will it happen? Listen, over the past 15 years or so, maybe 10 years for sure, I have predicted so many things incorrectly that I have to be absolutely humble here. Look, I think it gets harder and harder by the day, to be honest. You see true stories of courage. You see ordinary people. You see politicians doing what they can, where they can, to try to stem the tide of authoritarianism. And that's super admirable. But you don't get the sense that everyone is doing everything that they can. Everyone who's in a position to do something. That people are not necessarily in a position where we're taking a risk seems worth it, where mustering up the courage is actually what they're willing to do. I, unfortunately, and this is maybe too sad and cynical, I don't know, I think there needs to be a crisis. I really do. Hopefully it's not a crisis of democracy, because once democracy is in crisis, it's really hard to claw it back and to reestablish institutions. Arguably we're already there, but what I mean is a crisis that's, in the economy, or a nationwide outbreak of polio. I don't wish this on anything, but truly something that reminds us in the case of polio that, gosh darn it, maybe science matters. Maybe knowledge matters. It has an effect not just on statistics that are abstract and held by some government agency that I don't care about, but on my locality and on my family and on my loved ones and my acquaintances and whatever. When the universities are attacked, this is not just some other department that I never really cared about, but it has a material effect on the ability of people to pursue knowledge, right? So there needs to be some palpable material effect at the level of individuals, widespread enough that people are, truly awoken from any slumber that they might be in. So again, this is what, in one of those cases, I wish Trump would just have a change of heart, so he save us from that, the need to have some kind of a crisis.
He would just wake up and be a reasonable guy. Yeah, that would be nice.
I predict that will not happen.
That's a prediction. It's a fool's game, and that's a prediction I'll go with you on.
Good one.
Well, on that note, Ed, thank you so much. That was very informative. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn.
And me, Maria Rybnikova.
The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Whiff. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Jumno Pedi No. 1, arranged and performed also by Whiff. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com.
Thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys.